The air smelled of limestone dust and river water, and somewhere above the heat of the Nile Valley, a woman was deciding the shape of the sky. Her name was Hatshepsut. She had been regent, then pharaoh, then something the Egyptian language had no word for. A woman who wore the double crown not by accident, but by intention, who ruled not in the shadow of a husband or a son, but in her own extraordinary light. She had been on the throne for nearly 2 decades. 2 decades of harvest and monument, of trade routes opened and temples raised, of a kingdom so well governed that even her enemies could find little to say against the work itself. Settle in, pull the blanket a little closer, because this story deserves your full stillness. It is somewhere around the year 1470, before the Common Era. Egypt is at the height of its new kingdom glory. The Nile floods on schedule. The granaries are full, and at a place called Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of the Nile, a structure is rising from the desert that will outlast almost everything human beings have ever built. 3 colonnaded terraces carved directly into the limestone cliffs, their white faces catching the morning light like something that was always meant to be there, as though the mountain had simply been waiting for someone with enough vision to reveal it. Hatshepsut built that. She imagined it, commissioned it, oversaw it. She had herself depicted on its walls in the traditional garb of a pharaoh, the false beard, the crook, the flail, not as disguise, but as language. This is what a ruler looks like, she was saying, without saying it, and Egypt, in this particular season of its long life, accepted that statement. There is something achingly ordinary about the details that survive. She liked to be called His Majesty. Her architect's name was Senenu, and he was devoted to her in ways that historians have argued over for centuries and will never quite resolve. She sent a trading expedition to a faraway land called Punt, and brought back living frankincense trees, which she planted in rows at her temple, because she wanted the gods to smell the world she had made. A woman who traded for frankincense trees and planted them in rows for the gods. There is something in that detail that refuses to be grand, refuses to be distant. It simply aches. She was powerful. She was present. She was building things that would last 3,000 years. And somewhere, perhaps not far away, a young man was watching, learning, waiting, taking the measure of everything she had made. He would remember it all very carefully. It was not enough to hold the throne. She had known that from the beginning with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years watching power from its edges before she finally stood at its center. Her husband, Thutmose II, had been Pharaoh, and she had been beside him in the way that wives of pharaohs were beside their husbands. Present, important, and carefully secondary. When he died, their son was too young to rule, and so Hatshepsut became regent, which is a word that means you hold the weight without being given the title for it. She did that for a time. She held the weight, and then, somewhere between 1 year and the next, she made a decision that history would spend millennia trying to understand. She became pharaoh, not regent, not queen consort, not caretaker, pharaoh. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine what that required. Not the courage, which is obvious, but the precision. The throne of Egypt was not merely political, it was theological. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of Horus, son of the sun, the earthly, hinge between gods and men. And that role, in 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, had a shape. It had a beard. It had a headdress. It had a way of standing, a way of being carved into stone walls, a grammar of image and symbol so deeply established that to rule Egypt was, in some sense, to become that image, to put your body into that ancient outline and hold very still. So she did. She wore the double crown. She wore the false beard of braided metal that pharaohs had always worn, the one that signaled divinity rather than masculinity, though the two had become so entangled in the visual language of Egypt that they were nearly impossible to separate. She had herself depicted in statues as broad-shouldered and serene in the formal posture of a ruler at rest. And in temple carvings, she told a story. The gods themselves had chosen her, had announced her birth as a divine appointment. had placed the crown upon her before she was old enough to lift it. She was not pretending to be a man. She was insisting that the symbols of power belonged to whoever was powerful enough to wear them. But here is what the carvings do not show, what the stone cannot hold: the particular loneliness of a woman who must translate herself into an image before anyone will listen. The private language she must have spoken inside herself, in rooms where no one was watching, when the beard came off and the crown was set aside, and she was simply a person at the end of a long day, in a kingdom that needed her to be something larger than a person. What she wanted in those moments, no inscription records. The stone is quiet on that point, as stone always is, with the things that matter most. And yet the temples rose. And yet the frankincense trees grew in their careful rows. And yet she ruled magnificently, unmistakably, for 20 years. The boy who would become Thutmose III was growing up inside all of that magnificence, learning its every contour. There is a particular kind of anger that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with drums or declarations. It does not burn cities or raise armies against the living. It is quieter than that, and in many ways more devastating, because it does not come for the person. It comes for the memory. It waits until the person is gone, and the mourners have dispersed, and the oil lamps have been extinguished one by one, and then it gets to work in the dark, with tools, in silence, as though what it is doing is simply maintenance. Thutmose III became sole pharaoh when Hatshepsut died. Historians are not entirely certain how she died, or when exactly, or whether the transition was complicated by anything beyond the ordinary grief of a kingdom losing its ruler. She had governed well. The structures she built were extraordinary. The expedition to Punt was remembered. The terraced temple at Deir el-Bahari stood white and perfect against the cliffs, and anyone who looked at it knew immediately that whoever had commanded its construction had been someone of extraordinary vision and will. For a while he left it all alone. This is the part that catches in the throat if you sit with it long enough. Thutmose III was not a small ruler. He was, by almost any measure history applies, one of the greatest military commanders Egypt ever produced, a pharaoh who expanded the empire further than it had ever reached, who fought 17 campaigns, who understood logistics and strategy with a sophistication that military historians still study with something approaching admiration. He was not threatened by competence. He had plenty of his own, and yet, approximately 20 years after Hatshepsut's death, 20 years long enough that the decision could not have been impulsive, the chisels came out. They went to the temples first, to Deir el-Bahari, to Karnak, to every wall where her image had been carved in the formal posture of a pharaoh. They did not destroy the walls. They did not tear down the colonnades or fill the sanctuaries with rubble. They were far more careful than that. They excised her. They removed her face from the stone with the patience and precision of surgeons, chiseling away the features while leaving the background intact, replacing her image in some places with that of Thutmose II, or Thutmose's Teke, or Thutmose III himself, or simply smoothing the wall to blankness. Her name in its cartouche, that oval border that marked a royal name in hieroglyphics. The boundary that said this word is sacred was cut away wherever it appeared, replaced with a blank space or another name entirely. They filled her statues into pits, dozens of them, the great stone faces of Hatshepsut, some of them painted, some of them among the most accomplished sculpture Egypt had ever produced, were broken from their pedestals and buried in the ground near her temple, as though the earth itself were being asked to swallow the evidence. It was not erasure in anger. That is what makes it so chilling. It was erasure as policy, deliberate, methodical, pursued over years with the quiet persistence of bureaucratic intention. Someone had decided that she should not have existed. Not that she had been bad or wrong or dangerous, simply that she should not count, that her 2 decades of reign should be absorbed into the reigns of the men around her, like water disappearing into sand, leaving the surface dry and uninterrupted. In the long corridor of Egyptian history, the line of pharaohs would read, Thutmose II, then Thutmose III, a clean line, an unbroken line, and in the space where 20 years of a woman's rule had actually existed, simply nothing. It does not argue with what is placed inside it. It does not res it, stead or preserve by intention. It simply receives and closes over and continues to be sand, indifferent to whether what it holds is treasure or garbage, sacred or shameful, the face of a god queen or a broken piece of ordinary pot. The desert around Deir el-Bahari accepted the statues of Hatshepsut the way it accepted everything, without ceremony, without comment, without any indication that it understood what it was being asked to conceal. And then it waited. It waited through the rest of Thutmose III's long and celebrated reign. It waited through the reigns of his sons and their sons, through the Ramesside dynasties and the twilight of the New Kingdom, through invasions and upheavals and the slow geological patience of an empire unwinding. It waited while the temple above it, her temple, the one she had imagined and Senenmut had designed and 1,000 labourers had carved from living rock, continued to stand against the cliffs with the mild stubbornness of something that had simply decided not to fall down. Conquerors came through the valley. Religions changed. The language that had been chiseled into her walls became unreadable to the people walking past them, a beautiful mystery scratched into stone by people whose names no one could pronounce anymore. The temple endured. This is the thing about Hatshepsut that the men with chisels could not have fully anticipated, that she had built so much so well and in so many places that the project of removing her was always going to be incomplete. You cannot chisel a woman off 10,000 square feet of wall without leaving evidence of the chiseling. The very absence of her face in certain places became, eventually, a kind of signature. Historians would look at a smoothed wall, at a cartouche carefully excised, at a figure replaced with suspicious precision, and they would ask who was here, what was so threatening, about this particular presence that someone felt compelled to remove it with such care. Absence, it turns out, has a shape. There were other clues. Her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, which she had prepared for herself with the thoroughness of a pharaoh who fully expected to be remembered, sat beneath the rock and waited along with everything else. Objects bearing her name had been moved rather than destroyed in some cases, tucked into corners, buried in caches, surviving in the way that small things survive, by being overlooked. In the debris of centuries, her cartouche appeared on fragments. Her image surfaced occasionally in places the erasure had not reached in the smaller details of larger walls, in the shadows of colonnades, where the light had not been good enough for the workman to see clearly. She persisted in the way that the genuinely extraordinary always persists, not through rescue, not through anyone deciding to protect her, but through the sheer excess of her own achievement. There had simply been too much of her. The building program alone was so vast that to erase it entirely would have required tearing down half of Karnak, and no pharaoh, however motivated, was going to tear down half of Karnak. So the walls stood, and the sand held its patient cargo of broken faces, and 3,000 years moved over everything like weather, like the slow turning of a wheel so large that no one standing beside it could see it move. A woman named Hatshepsut had ruled Egypt for 20 years. The record had been altered to suggest otherwise, and the altered record had been accepted, more or less, for 3 millennia. Not because the truth had been destroyed, but simply because no one had yet looked at the right piece of sand in quite the right way. Someone eventually would. Here is the thing about a pattern. You cannot see it from inside a single instance of itself. If you know only Hatshepsut, you know a remarkable story. A woman who ruled was erased and waited in the sand for someone to find her. It is extraordinary enough on its own. It has the shape of a tragedy with a quiet redemption at the end, and it is possible to hold it that way, as a singular event, an anomaly in the long record of human civilization. One exceptional woman who rose, was resented, was removed from the story by smaller men who outlived her. But then you look again, you look a little further east, and a little further north, and across the particular darkness of centuries that do not always give up what they know, and you begin to see the same shape appearing again and again in different light, in different languages, on different continents, like a bruise that keeps surfacing on the same part of the body, no matter how many times it fades. Women who held power and were then unmade from the record of having held it, not by accident, not by the ordinary entropy of time, which loses things without prejudice and forgets men just as readily as women, but deliberately, with intention, with the specific practiced efficiency of people who understood exactly what they were doing and did not particularly feel the need to justify it. It was, in other words, a method. In China, the Empress Wu Zetian ruled in her own name for 15 years at the end of the 7th century, the only woman in 4,000 years of Chinese imperial history to do so. She was brilliant and ruthless and effective, and after her death, the historians of the dynasties that followed worked with quiet diligence to paint her as a monster, a usurper, a seductress. A woman whose power could only be explained as aberration or evil because the alternative explanation was too destabilizing to permit. She was not erased from the record entirely because she had ruled too recently and visibly for that, but she was reframed, which is a more sophisticated form of the same operation. You do not remove the woman, you remove her legitimacy. You leave her in the story but change what her presence in it means. In Rome, a woman named Livia Drusilla stood at the center of the early empire for more than 50 years, wife of Augustus, mother of Tiberius, architect of a dynasty in ways that the official record attributed entirely to the men whose names appeared on the coins. She was there always, just at the edge of the documented decisions, exerting an influence that contemporaries acknowledged privately, and the formal history absorbed into the accomplishments of the emperors she had helped to create. She became, in the telling, a background figure, a wife, a mother, a supportive presence in someone else's story. There was a woman in ancient Mesopotamia whose name was Kubaba, and she appears in the Sumerian king list. That ancient record of rulers as the only female entry, described as a tavern keeper who became king and whose dynasty lasted 100 years. One entry among hundreds, and scholars have argued for generations about whether she was real, whether the dynasty was real, whether the 100 years was symbolic, as though the uncertainty itself were not a kind of answer about what happens to women's records over time. The pattern is not subtle. Once you see it, it is the same gesture made in different costumes across 3,000 years of recorded civilization. A woman accumulates power. The power is real, measurable in buildings, in policy, in the loyalty of people who served her, and the fear of people who opposed her. And then, at some hinge point, the record is adjusted, the chisel comes out, or the ink is reapplied, or the historian frames his sentences in a particular way, and the woman remains in history, but a different size. Smaller, softer, more decorative, more explicable, more comfortable for the people who will read about her later. And in the silence left by all of that adjusting, you can almost hear them. The women who built things that are still standing, who made decisions that shaped the world their erasers inherited, who were present at every consequential moment and have been placed, carefully, just out of frame. She was everywhere and then she was nowhere, and no one left a note explaining the difference. For a time, Nefertiti was the most visible woman in the ancient world. This is not poetry or exaggeration, it is almost literally true. During the reign of her husband, the Pharaoh Akhenaten, in the 14th century before the Common Era, she appeared on temple walls and boundary stelae, and offering tables with a frequency that had no precedent in Egyptian royal art. She was depicted smiting enemies, which was a pose traditionally reserved for pharaohs alone. She was shown making offerings to the sun disk, the Aten, the single god her husband had installed at the center of Egyptian religion in one of the ancient world's most radical acts of theological reorganization. She wore a crown of her own design, that tall, flat-topped blue cylinder that her sculptors rendered with such confidence that it became, across 3,000 years, entirely inseparable from her face. She was not beside Akhenaten in these images. She was beside him, and sometimes in front of him, and sometimes acting in a capacity that the images suggest was less wife and more co-ruler, though the exact boundaries of her authority are a question that Egyptologists have been arguing about with great feeling and impressive footnotes for over a century. And then, somewhere around the 12th year of Akhenaten's 17-year reign, she stops appearing, not gradually, not in the slow way that a person's pub lice presence naturally recedes as age or illness or circumstance changes their role. She simply stops. The walls that had been dense with her image go quiet. Her name, which had appeared in texts and dedications with the regularity of someone at the absolute center of a religious and political program, becomes rare and then absent. A woman who had been documented with extraordinary thoroughness disappears from that documentation, as though someone turned off a light in a room she had occupied for 12 years. What happened is one of history's most beautiful and maddening unsolved questions. The theories are numerous and contradictory, which is its own kind of evidence about how little was left behind to resolve them. Perhaps she died. Disease in the ancient world did not pause for important people, and the royal family of Akhenaten's court suffered losses that the records gesture toward without explaining. Perhaps she fell from favour, though what falling from favour meant for a woman of her documented authority in that particular court is itself an open question. Perhaps, and this is the theory that resurfaces every few decades with new evidence and new controversy, she did not disappear at all. Perhaps she changed her name, assumed a new identity, and continue to rule, not as Nefertiti, but as a shadowy pharaoh named Nefertiti, or even, some have suggested, as the mysterious figure who preceded Tutankhamun on the throne and whose identity the record has never convincingly resolved. Perhaps the vanishing was not a vanishing at all. Perhaps it was a transformation. What we know with certainty is this. A woman of extraordinary power and visibility left behind one of the most recognized faces in human history, a limestone bust discovered in 1912 in the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmoses, painted with such skill and such obvious care that it has lived in museum ever since and continues to stop people in their tracks. A face that has been reproduced on more surfaces than almost any other face from the ancient world. A face that says quietly and without apology, I was here, I was seen. Someone took great care to record exactly what I looked like. And behind that face, a life that the record swallowed almost completely. There is a particular kind of grief in a beautiful object with no explanation attached to it. The bust survives. The story does not. And so we stand in front of her in museums. The tourists and the scholars and the schoolchildren on field trips, and we look at the painted eyes that look serenely back at us across 33 centuries, and we understand that she is keeping something from us, not by choice, but because the people who might have written it down decided, for reasons we will now never fully know, that she had already taken up enough room in the record. The blue crown is still perfect. The face is still calm. History does not announce itself to the people living inside it. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating truth that any study of the past eventually delivers, that the moments we now recognize as hinges, as the last breath before everything changed, were experienced by the people inside them as simply another day. The bread was baked. The water was drawn. A child was scolded for something small and forgettable. The sun came up over the same rooftops it had risen over the day before, and the day before that, and there was nothing in its particular angle or colour to suggest that this morning was different from any other morning. Caremen, that this ordinary Tuesday of the ancient world was in fact the last one, the final entry in a chapter that was about to be closed by someone else's hand. Think of the women in this story on their last documented days. Hatshepsut, somewhere in the buildings, she had spent a reign constructing and refining, perhaps in the temple complex at Karnak, where her additions had transformed the sacred space into something almost incomprehensibly grand. Perhaps she walked through it that morning with the eye of someone who has looked at a thing so many times it has become part of how they understand. Themselves seeing not the stone, but the decision behind each stone, remembering the conversation with Senenmut about this column's height, The particular argument about that gateway's orientation relative to the rising sun. Perhaps a servant brought her something to eat, something with honey in it, because she was Pharaoh and honey was abundant, and why not? Perhaps she gave an instruction about something administrative, some detail of grain distribution or temple maintenance, the ordinary bureaucratic texture of running a kingdom on a regular afternoon. She did not know the chisels were coming. This is the fact that presses against the chest if you hold it long enough. She had no reason to know. She had ruled for 20 years. The structure of her power was established. The monuments were built. The trade routes were open. The gods had been properly honored in the proper temples with the proper offerings. There was no visible threat. Thutmose III was a capable general and an obedient co-ruler, or seemed so. Whatever tensions existed between them, and some must have existed, they always do, they had not yet expressed themselves in any way that would have suggested to her that after her death, her name would be the thing he chose to fight. She walked through her morning not knowing she was walking through her last ordinary one. And think of Nefertiti, in the 12th year of a reign she had spent at the absolute centre of a radical religious and political transformation. Perhaps in the city of Akhenaten that her husband had built in the desert, specifically to honour his singular god, a city of white limestone and wide processional avenues, new enough that it still smelled of fresh construction, designed from nothing by people who believed they were building the future of a civilization. Perhaps she was in one of the open-air temples where worship was conducted under actual sky, rather than in the traditional darkness of enclosed sanctuary, because Akhenaten's god was the sun, and the sun required openness. Perhaps she was planning something, a ceremony or a building or a diplomatic response to something happening at the empire's distant edges, and somewhere in that ordinary administrative, fully inhabited day, something shifted. A conversation that went wrong, a decision made by someone she trusted or someone she feared. An illness that arrived without warning, as illness does, indifferent to the inconvenience of its timing. We do not know. We will not know. The record that might have told us was either never made or was lost or was removed by the same general human impulse that removed so much else, the impulse to tidy history into a shape that is easier to explain than the truth of it. What remains is the morning itself, ordinary and unremarkable, still faintly worn to the touch across 33 centuries. A woman was living in it, fully and without premonition. Every resurrection begins with someone who cannot let something go. It is rarely a grand impulse. It does not usually arrive with the drama that the story, in retrospect, seems to deserve. It arrives instead as a quiet irritation, an itch in the mind that will not resolve itself no matter how many other things are placed on top of it. A detail that does not fit. A wall that has been smoothed in a way that smoothed walls are not usually smoothed. A name that appears in one document and then vanishes from every subsequent document without the kind of explanation that the disappearance of an important name usually generates. Something small and stubborn lodged in the attention of someone who has been trained to notice exactly these kinds of things and who has made the particular life choice of caring about them. The story of how Hatshepsut came back begins, in the modern sense, in the 19th century, when European archaeologists descended on Egypt with the enormous energy and the considerable cultural presumption of an era that believed the past was something that could simply be picked up and carried home. They came to the temple at Deir el-Bahari and they saw what any careful observer would eventually see, that the walls had been worked on twice, that there were places where the stone had a different texture, where the images had a slightly different relationship to the background, where the inscriptions carried the faint ghost of an earlier inscription beneath them. Someone had been here before, they understood. Someone had made changes. The question was, who and why, and what had been underneath? A man named Carl Lepsius had begun cataloguing Egyptian monuments in the 1840s, producing records of inscriptions and images with a thoroughness that would prove invaluable decades later when the questions became more specific. He did not solve the puzzle of Hatshepsut himself, but he preserved pieces of it. the way careful people preserve things whose importance they sense without yet being able to name. It was an American named Herbert Winlock who, in the early 20th century, stood at the edge of a pit near Deir el-Bahari and understood what he was looking at. The pit contained fragments, hundreds of them, thousands of them, of broken statuary, heads and hands and the formal, serene torsos of figures that had once stood in the colonnaded terraces of a temple above. Winlock recognized the style. He recognized the scale, and he began the slow, extraordinary work of understanding that what had been thrown into this pit was not garbage, but a person, or, rather, the systematic dismantling of a person's image, carried out with the methodical patience of official policy. He spent years on it, on his knees in the debris of 3,000 years, brushing sand from painted stone, cataloguing fragments, attempting the impossible jigsaw of reassembling not just the statues but the story behind their destruction. And there were others. Jean-François Champollion had cracked the code of hieroglyphics in 1822. Which meant that for the first time in over 1,000 years, the inscriptions on these walls could be read, actually read, not guessed at or admired for their visual beauty, but understood, word by word, like a letter from someone very far away. When scholars began reading the walls of Deir el-Bahari with that new fluency, they found anomalies, pronouns that switched gender mid-inscription, titles that did not grammatically agree with the images beside them, a text that referred to a ruler in the feminine, and then, in the next phrase, corrected itself into the masculine, as though whoever carved it had been working from an original and had not quite completed the revision. The walls were speaking once someone knew the language, and what they were saying, haltingly and incompletely, through the gaps and the smoothed places and the replaced cartouches, was a name. It took a long time. The full picture of who Hatshepsut had been and what had happened to her image emerged over decades, through the work of dozens of scholars across multiple countries, each one adding a piece to something that kept revealing itself to be larger and more significant than the previous piece had suggested. A woman named a woman named Christine Wozibski, a curato. Ra named Kara Cooney, who would later write about Hatshepsut with the kind of attention that feels like a form of devotion. These were among the people who continued pushing, continued asking, continued refusing to accept the smoothed wall as the final answer. Because a smoothed wall is never the final answer. Stone remembers everything. This is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. It is a physical fact about the nature of carved rock that the people who ordered the erasures may not have fully understood, or may have understood and simply accepted as the best available option, which amounts to the same helplessness. When you chisel a name from limestone, you remove the raised portions of the carving, the parts that catch the light and cast the shadows that make the image legible. But the stone beneath those portions has been changed by the original carving, compressed, stressed, altered at the molecular level by the tool that first cut it. The surface remembers the pressure, and when the right kind of light falls across a wall at the right angle, when the sun is low enough in the sky that it rakes across the stone, almost horizontally, catching every texture and variation in the surface, the ghost of what was carved there first can sometimes be seen. Egyptologists call it raking light. It is one of the simplest and most quietly astonishing techniques in the entire history of archaeological discovery. You do not need sophisticated equipment or modern technology. You need patience and good timing and the willingness to be standing in front of a wall at the particular hour of day when the light does what it does, which is reveal. At Karnak, in the great temple complex that Hatshepsut had expanded with the ambition of someone who understood that building was a form of argument, there are walls that have been read twice. Read once in the ordinary way, in the ordinary light, yielding the text that the erasure intended to leave behind, and read again in the raking light of early morning or late afternoon, yielding something older. The faint, indelible impression of what was there before the chisels came, her cartouche pressed into the stone by the original craftsman with the care and precision that royal inscriptions demanded, has been found in this way in places that the erasure missed or incompletely addressed, not visible to the casual eye. not visible to the workman who smoothed the surface apparently, but visible to the scholar with the patience to wait for the right hour and the knowledge to understand what the shadows are saying. Her name in hieroglyphics is a small and beautiful thing. It sits inside its oval border, the cartouche that marks it as royal, and it reads in the transliteration that modern Egyptologists use as Hatshepsut, which means roughly foremost of noble women, foremost of noble women, foremost of noble women. A name that was chosen as royal names in Egypt were always chosen with the intention that it would be spoken forever, carved into stone, and repeated in ritual and remembered by a civilization that believed very seriously in the power of a name to keep a person present in the world. The name survived its own erasure. It survived in the pits where the statues were buried because the statues themselves carried it, and the pits were sealed and forgotten rather than destroyed, preserving what they were meant to conceal with the ironic thoroughness of very good hiding. It survived on the smaller objects. The canopic jars and the shabtis and the fragments of funerary equipment that had been dispersed across the valley in the slightly chaotic way that ancient record-keeping sometimes dispersed things, placed in a corner, overlooked in a recount, surviving by the unglamorous mechanism of simply being missed. It survived on the walls of her mortuary temple, in places where the erasure had been applied to the prominent images but had not extended to the smaller inscriptions, in the less visited side chambers, where the light was poor and the access was difficult, and the workman had perhaps decided that no one would look this closely. And in 1822, when Champollion gave the modern world the key to reading hieroglyphics, all of that survival became suddenly legible. The name that had been waiting in the stone for 3,000 years became readable again, not in the way that the original inscription had been readable, publicly, officially, carved in a place of honor, but in the more intimate way that a letter found in a drawer is readable, privately, unexpectedly, with the particular emotion that comes from understanding that someone went to great lengths to make sure you would never read this, and you are reading it anyway. Scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries began assembling the evidence with the devotion of people who understood that they were doing something more than archaeology. Howard Carter, who would later discover Tutankhamun's tomb, worked at Deir el-Bahari in the 1890s and noted the anomalies in the wall treatments. Herbert Winlock catalogued the broken statues. Egyptologist after Egyptologist added their portion, a fragment here, a reading there, a grammatical observation about a pronoun that did not agree with the image it described, and slowly, with the patience that the work demanded and that the subject seemed almost to require, a picture assembled itself. A woman, a pharaoh, 20 years of extraordinary rule, a systematic erasure carried out with the efficiency of official policy. And underneath all of it, underneath the smoothed walls and the replaced cartouches and the filled pits and the 3,000 years of accumulated silence, a name, foremost of noble women, still there. The sun rises over Deir el-Bahari the same way it has always risen. It comes first as a pale suggestion above the eastern cliffs, a softening of the darkness rather than a replacement of it, and then gradually, with the unhurried patience of something that has been doing this for longer than anything on earth can fully comprehend, it fills the valley with a light that is specific to this place and this hour, warm and horizontal and extraordinarily clear, the kind of light that makes the limestone cliffs look as though they are generating their own brightness from within. The temple catches it early. The three colonnaded terraces, still standing after 35 centuries against the rock face that Hatshepsut chose for them with the eye of someone who understood exactly how this light would fall, receive the morning with the composure of something that has survived too much to be surprised by anything as ordinary as another dawn. Tourists come now, in the early hours before the heat builds, and they walk through the colonnades and look at the walls and read the information on the printed guides they carry. And some of them stop in front of a carved image or a recovered inscription and feel something they cannot quite name, a weight, a recognition. the particular vertigo of standing in a place where the distance between then and now collapses suddenly, without warning. And you understand with your body, rather than your mind, that the person who ordered these columns was a person, with a body that was warm and a voice that had a specific sound and preferences about food and opinions about architecture, and something she wanted that she never said out loud. We found Hatshepsut because the evidence was there, preserved in the sand and the stone and the raking light of the right hour. But the finding was never really a rescue. She did not need us to, rescue her. She had survived the chisels and the pits, and 3 millennia of official silence through the excess of her own achievement, through the sheer accumulated weight of what she had built and decided and set in motion during 20 years of extraordinary governance. We did not restore her to history. We restored history to her, corrected the record to reflect what the record had always imperfectly contained, adjusted the official story to match the evidence that had been quietly insisting on itself for 3,000 years. And she was not alone in that insistence. Nefertiti's face had waited in a sculptor's workshop, packed in rubble and forgotten, until 1912, when a German archaeologist named Ludwig Borchardt unwrapped it and stood very still for a long moment, understanding what he was holding. Zetian's reign could not be undone by the historians who reframed her, because she had ruled for too long and too visibly and left too many administrative and architectural traces for the reframing to fully take. The women of the Sumerian king list left their names in clay that dried and hardened and refused to dissolve. Livia Drusilla appears in enough contemporary sources, enough private letters and administrative documents, and the resentful observations of people who found her influence inconvenient, that her presence at the centre of the early Roman Empire cannot be wished away, regardless of how the official histories distribute credit. They persisted, not heroically, not with the dramatic intention of someone who knows they are being erased and is fighting back against it. They persisted simply because they had been real, and reality leaves residue. The buildings stand, the objects survive, the clay hardens. The stone remembers the pressure of the original tool, and eventually, given enough time and enough people willing to look carefully at things, the re-side-do becomes legible. This is perhaps what the story is finally about. Not the erasure, which is real and worth grieving, but the insufficiency of erasure as a permanent solution to the inconvenient existence of powerful women. The people who picked up the chisels believed, presumably, that what they were doing was final, that you could remove a name from a wall and the name would cease to matter, cease to exert in any meaningful sense, cease to exert its pressure on the story that came after. They were practical people making a practical calculation about how memory works, and they were wrong. Memory does not work the way a wall works. You cannot chisel something out of it cleanly and leave the surface smooth and untroubled. The absence itself becomes evidence. The smoothed place draws the eye. The missing name generates the question, and the question eventually generates the scholarship, and the scholarship eventually generates the knowledge. And the knowledge eventually generates the moment when a person stands in front of a limestone wall in the early morning light and reads, in the shadows left by an ancient tool in ancient stone, a name that someone very badly wanted to silence. Foremost of noble women, she had always been there, patient as stone, quiet as the desert, waiting in the way that only the truly enduring can wait. Not with urgency, not with desperation, but with the absolute and untroubled confidence of something that knows in whatever way stone and memory and the residue of a real life can know anything, that the light will eventually come around to the right angle, and when it does, the name will still be there.